There is no death, man. That which you call death does not exist, except in the imagination. People do not understand me when I speak. They cannot comprehend. No sorrowing, and no black clothes.
When Dr. William Price of Llantrisant died, exactly 100 years ago, and at the age of 92, a crowd of people, 20,000 strong, flocked into this small village to see the old man off. Yet, thumbing through a history book just this week, Wales 1800 to 1900, the century that his life spanned, I found that he didn't even merit a mention.
Is there anything you can tell me about Dr. William Price?
Never heard of him.
Is there anything you know about Dr. William Price?
No.
Nothing at all?
No.
He died 100 years ago.
Died 100 years ago.
He was born at Llantrisant, and he's the first man who had cremations at Pontypridd. He had a son called Jesus and a daughter, Mary.
People do know something about Price's life. They know about the cremation, they know about his work as a doctor, they may know about one or two other episodes, but there are some major issues that tend to be forgotten. Price, after all, was a rebel, even a revolutionary at some times. He did declare that he was opposed to the power of those who ran this society.
Price was an individualist, and therefore problematic to historians who have been hard put to pigeonhole him. Too much about him was eccentric, cranky, shady even. So, at a moment in time when Wales's sense of identity and community is yet again in crisis, perhaps William Price is worth one final look to see if there indeed was some method in his madness.
He was concerned about the cultural identity of his community, which has changed fundamentally in the period since his death. There is something in common, though, between his concerns and ours. William Price has fallen out of our history because the history of the people of South Wales who now speak English does not receive serious attention. We do not, in the media, in the press, on television and radio today, get anything like a full picture of the history, the culture of the community in which we live.
Wales 1800, and a moment of monumental change for the lush hills and crystal streams of the South Wales valleys. The rape of the fair country had begun. Soon a mantle of black dust would cover a scarred and plundered landscape. Coal and iron were to transform the tranquil vales into a vision of hell. This was the Wales then, into which William Price was born, on the night of March the 4th, 1800, the fifth of 7 children, born to the Reverend William Price M.A. and his wife Mary, in a cottage at Tinnacoy Quay in the rural parish of Rydri. Even as a young man, he managed to shock the entire neighbourhood. In good weather, he would undress and expose his naked body to sun and wind alike on the local hillside. This is a habit he might have picked up from his father, who it was rumoured was also something of a naturist. William was a star pupil. He passed all his exams with honours and learned to speak and read English, a language forbidden at home. After 3.5 years at the school, he was offered a post as assistant master, But William had already set his mind firmly on becoming a doctor. At the age of 14, he left home to become assistant to Dr. Evan Edwards of Caerphilly. In 1820, after 5 years with the doctor, he left Caerphilly for London and the Royal College of Surgeons. He shared rooms with a fellow student, Daniel Edwards, brother to his old employer. Both short of cash, they pooled their resources and threw themselves into intensive study. Within 12 months, William Price had passed the examinations of both college and hall, a feat never accomplished in the college's history, either before or since.
We don't know why Dr. Price made the decision to reject a promising career in London and to return to a potentially obscure life in Pontypridd, but it was surely influenced by his Druidic beliefs, his commitment to the Welsh people, and his pride in the beauty of the Welsh landscape. For whatever reasons, it is known that Price became medical officer at Ynys Works, Pontypridd in 1823, and remained there for many years, gaining a reputation for inspired methods of treatment. Price visited poor and wealthy alike and treated them with herb and flower remedies. A committed vegetarian and naturist, Price said,
"All disease is a result of an impure bloodstream caused by wrong and faulty habits of living."
In keeping with his general attitude to life, Price was not content to merely doctor. He applied his skills as an enigmatic orator to lambast the majority of the medical profession for their narrow-mindedness and their profiteering acts of butcherism.
Doctors should be forced to pay the expenses of people they had allowed to fall ill.
Price was not perhaps the most popular of men amongst his medical peers, but he was most certainly regarded with respect by those people for whom he cared, most notably his poorest patients, who benefited from the doctor's private application of a prototype National Health Service, whereby the rich paid handsomely whilst the poor were treated free. He believed that instead of concentrating on curing symptoms, doctors and society as a whole should look to the causes of ill health and thus deal with the wider implications of the new industrial lifestyle that left many people ill-nourished and at the mercy of unsafe machinery in workplaces and with a growing dependency on prescribed drugs.
I have not seen anybody or anything greater than nature to worship. Man is greater than God, for man created God in his own image.
Price believed that religion was the result of primitive man's fear of the unknown and an attempt to explain the threatened phenomena of nature. He declared that he did not believe in God or in devil, virgin or saint, and that religion throughout time had been used by kings and priests to keep the people down. Price had plenty to say about the church. He hated its gloomy sermons and Puritan preachers. They would thunder cannons at each other throughout his life.
The chapel preachers never lead the people except at funerals. They are always on the side of the rich and are merely concerned in seeing that the people believe in the divine origin of landlords and masters.
The hierarchy of the church was furious and retaliated by spreading dark rumours about Price and his heathen ways. Week after week, they would use the pulpit to incite fear and hatred amongst the faithful. On one occasion, the preachers invented a story whereby Price was supposed to have desecrated the grave of his father, removed his body and cut off his head in some pagan ritual. The truth was that Price exhumed the body and performed a post-mortem in order to settle a law case concerned with his father's mental illness. These stories, however, had the desired effect, and even those people who had been tolerant of Price now turned against him.
Dr. William Price, having offended the ear of the church with his outspoken denunciation of Christian worship, went on to offend their eyes with his appearance. His plaited hair and beard he grew as long as nature allowed. Upon his head he wore a large fox's skin. Its legs and tail hung pendant to his shoulders. Tight trousers of red and green stripes and scarlet waistcoat with gold buttons was his everyday uniform. He claimed that his dress was the traditional attire of the ancient founders of the Druidic system. His interest in paganism can be traced back to the youths who roamed the hills naked, dancing and chanting as he went.
You must remember that Pontypridd and this area in the middle of the last century was very different to what it is today. It was much more like, say, North Wales, Gwynedd today. The overwhelming majority of the people were Welsh and they were Welsh speaking. The ironmasters, who were overwhelmingly English, treated the people of South Wales in an almost colonial manner. The Welsh language and Welsh culture were to them an inferior culture. Price was one of the few people who had the nerve to stand up against this kind of cultural colonialism. And that is what his attempts to revive Druidism and some of his quite bizarre Druidic activities were in fact about.
Thus, on moonlit nights, he visited these ancient burial grounds on Pontypridd Common, and astride this rocking stone performed self-styled Druidic rites, chanting the song of the primitive bard to the moon, to the astonishment of onlookers. Pitheads and steelworks had replaced a rural landscape alive with pagan festivals, tradition and crafts. He saw his nation of free thinkers and dreamers being speedily industrialized, despoiled and abused by a ruling class with no concern for his Celtic heritage. Price believed that his contemporary Druids, the High Welsh, were a close society of dour ceremonialists who offered small inspiration to the working class people of Wales. In an attempt to redress this cultural imbalance, he printed and distributed a pamphlet describing his intention to build a mighty tower on the ancient site of the Rocking Stone. The tower was to be 100 foot high and would contain a museum, a scientific institution, and most importantly, a free school for the children of the poor. Here the language, the music, and the culture of the ancient Britons would be taught. Price's pamphlet requested donations totaling the £1,000 required for the innovative project. To Price's dismay, the response was not as he had anticipated.
I imagined, like a child, there would be no difficulty in inspiring in the whole length and breadth of Britain 1,000 ladies and gentlemen to subscribe a sovereign each. I see a vote in the House of Commons granting £70,000 for repairing a Queen's stables for a few horses, and but 30,000 of the people's own money for educating a whole nation of 26 million, laughing me in the face.
Price was left frustrated and disappointed by his failure to build a centre of Druidic culture for his people. Perhaps the nation was not yet ready for his New Age ideals, Or perhaps he had not sold his vision in the right way. Whatever the reason, he did not have time to dwell on the matter. Events for once overtook him. A national outcry for a wider democratic government and fundamental changes in the system of government was developing in the form of the Chartist movement. Working people banded together and set out their demands to the government in the form of a People's Charter. Its principles of increased rights for workers and the rebellious nature of the struggle reflected Price's feelings and fired his imagination. Firstly, he attacked the coal kings.
You are the Welsh pharaohs who think you can suck the lifeblood of the colliers forever. You have grown fat and prosperous. You own the big houses, you wear the finest clothes, your children are healthy and happy, yet you do not work. How then you have got these things by idleness? Remember that the oppression of the pharaohs of Egypt did not last forever, and neither will the oppression of the blood-sucking pharaohs of Wales.
Like the pharaohs of Egypt and their pyramids, the coal and iron barons are remembered in history for their achievements, but the industrialisation that they led was built on the exploitation of the working people of Wales.
Price, after all, was a rebel. He was prepared at one point in his life even to contemplate taking part in a revolutionary movement to overthrow these people. Those are not ideas that historians are yet comfortable with. Price was too much of a revolutionary in some senses, and those aspects of our history are not yet openly, properly dealt with.
There are two worlds, not heaven and earth, but the world of the mansion and the world of the cottage, the world of the master and the world of the slave, and the world of the exploiter and the world of the exploited. And between these two worlds there has begun a relentless and grim struggle.
Wasting no time, he became elected leader of the Pontypridd and Merthyr Chartists. On the night of his election, he shook the conscience of his comrades with a fiery 2-hour speech.
We must have an understanding of our cause in our minds, the principle of our cause in our hearts, the power of our cause in our conscience, and the strength of our cause in our right arm, strength that will enable us to meet our oppressors boldly, fearlessly, upright on our feet. Remember that freedom is our birthright, and for that we are prepared to give our lives. We are the descendants of valiant Welshmen, and we must be worthy of the traditions which they have passed on to us. It is far better that we should die fighting for something more than our own freedom, for that of our children and the children of our children.
Meanwhile, back in London, the Charter was being rejected by the ruling class. The Chartist advocates of direct action prepared for battle. The uprising in Wales centred on Newport. When the Chartists arrived in Newport, they found the West Gate filled with waiting soldiers who fired on them from all sides, killing many. But Price's delegation did not attend, even though he is reputed to have acquired a cannon for the occasion. He claimed that there was a plot to assassinate him at the West Gate. The Chartist leaders that were involved in the uprising were deported, and Price too became a wanted man. Amidst the turmoil, Price claimed that he disguised himself as a woman and stole a passage to France beneath the noses of a witch-hunting constabulary, and that during his stay he became fascinated by an ancient stone in the Louvre. Its bizarre and illegible inscriptions he recorded and claimed to spend 20 years deciphering. The stone declared that he, Dr. William Price, archdruid, was the rightful heir to govern the world. The desperate working conditions which led to the uprisings waned, and the Chartist movement slowly gave way to the trade union movement.
Throughout his life, Price fought an endless series of court battles. He couldn't stand law or lawyers, seeing them along with the church and its ministers as being in the pay of the rich, agents to landlords and capitalism. Price, however, would go to court at the drop of a hat over the most trivial matters. He once charged the assistant bailiff of the county court with owing him 10 pence.
As my brain has been ploughed and harrowed for the last 5 months, and sown by the conspirators with the seeds of villainy and malice, I beg you to listen to me patiently, and with all the indulgence you can afford.
Price used the courts to ridicule the royalty and attack the state and confound the judiciary. Price, as always, conducted his own defence, this time subverting the dignity of the court by appointing his infant daughter, Ayalis, as his learned counsel. His defence speech was worth waiting for.
Cannot Her Majesty, as the mighty huntress in her day before the land, go out like the sun to find beasts of prey enough for her bloodhounds, without hunting them to sacrifice the liberty and the life of an innocent man upon her criminal altars, without the bloody hands of her priesthood? What? Does the equivalent Queen of Great Britain, the mistress of the civilized world in her day, fear the light of the sun, living in a drop of dew, and identified in the name of William Price?
The jury took just 20 minutes to come to a verdict. The crowded courtroom had waited until past 1 in the morning for the result, and cheered enthusiastically when Price was found not guilty. When he reached the streets, a crowd greeted him with great howls of applause.
I have found it unnecessary to enter into any legal marriage, because I do not, as any evolved being, require any law or religious ceremony to compel me to love the woman I have chosen as my mate. The artificial thunder of the church and the state cannot frighten me to live with any woman under compulsion. No law made by God or man can compel a man and a woman to love each other. But it can and does compel them to live with each other, which is quite another thing.
When you consider that he lived in a time when to disobey church law was a great sin, you have to admire his cheek. His words have a logic, but apply more aptly to our way of living today than valley life of yesteryear.
I want to see marriage become a union freely accepted, freely maintained, and freely dissolved with mutual consent. The community should only intervene in order to safeguard that which is of vital interest to it, namely the children.
And yet, what of the women he lived with, who bore him 7 children? To live without legal ceremony was to be ostracized and cut off from family. Any disapproval would not have had any effect on the fearless Dr. Price, but his housekeepers, as he called his lovers, may have found that living with this inflated ego wasn't the romantic ideal they thought it might have been. So what happened to these women? Well, the only one that we can be certain of is Gwenlloyn Llywelyn, 60 years Price's junior and from Welsh farming stock, who gave birth to 3 children and was described by a newspaper journalist who interviewed her as a modern Amazon. Gwenlloyn outlived Price and promised to ensure that his wish to be cremated, as outlined in a detailed will, was carried out. It was Gwenlloyn, the last of his loves, who bore the 83-year-old doctor his much-beloved son Iesu Grist, the Welsh name for Jesus Christ. Price announced that the child would one day restore a utopian druidic kingdom to Wales and the world. 5 months later, the baby died. Price had long been an advocate of cremation, and in the evening of January the 13th, 1884, a Sunday, he carried the precious body of his dead son to the top of Kylan Field overlooking Llantrisant. He set his tiny linen-wrapped bundle onto a cask of oil and set a torch to it.
News of this blasphemous act soon spread. The people of Llantrisant left their chapel and set up the hill. By the time they reached the top, they had turned into an angry mob, some armed with sticks and clubs.
The police had also been informed and arrived just in time to snatch the half-burnt infant from the flames and to stop some of the mob from throwing Price into them. Price was arrested and spent the night at Pontypridd police station.
After an inquest was held into the child's death, and against the wishes of the police, Price's demand for the return of the child's body was granted.
Ignoring the dangerous anger that he had raised, on March the 21st, he once again returned to Carlion Field, and this time using half a ton of coal, cremated his son unhindered.
Dr. Price was indicted at the next Cardiff Assizes for the cremation of the dead body of his child in a case that was to become famous throughout the world.
It is not right that a carcass should be allowed to rot and decompose in the earth. It results in wastage of good land, pollution of the earth, water and air, and is a constant danger to all living creatures.
During the trial, Price received thousands of letters of support from all over Britain. In his final judgment, Justice Stevens maintained that cremation of the dead was not illegal, provided it was carried out in such a manner not to cause a nuisance. The legal precedent was set.
Price's fight was not just for democracy and justice. He was a cultural alchemist who used every means he could to hold the Welsh people together. His Chartism, resistance to courts and churches, and even his infamous Druidism were all parts of his struggle to defend a Welsh identity.
There is therefore an issue of cultural identity for us in the same way as there was for William Price, although it is now an issue of the identity of a community which is speaking a different language. He is perhaps easier to understand now for people in Welsh-speaking Wales for that reason. I think he's probably easier to understand for the young people who are coming up through Welsh medium schools now than he is to understand for those of us who speak only English. That is a major difficulty.
On the day of his cremation, thousands of people gathered at Llantrisant, and by the evening most of the crowd had dispersed. Only close family remained, as Dr. Price's flame burnt on.
Do you think that I, who have existed upon this earth for 10,000 years, cannot tell what the future has in store for me? Yes, indeed. I shall never see death. Do you see that child? Now, do you understand?